I'll take that. Timekeeper says it's time, so that's the key to that. So good evening to all of you. Hope you've had a good week to this point. Hope I don't change that. That's my goal, not to change your week. So we've got, for us, a fairly long list for our prayer list tonight of things that people that need our prayer. So we'll go through that, and if you've got something to add, we'll certainly look for that as well. And Kelly is scheduled for hernia surgery Friday. Linda Zell is having issues with blood pressure. She is feeling well enough that she's in the ladies' class tonight, so we're glad to hear that. Kathy Crawford had hip replacement surgery yesterday, but she's doing well at this point of her recovery. Laura Kyle has started taking radiation treatments. Sylvia Robinson is scheduled for surgery to put a titanium plate in her jaw on Monday. Loretta Davis starts radiation on Monday as well. Christine is at home recovering from breast cancer surgery, and Jerry Wallace had knee replacement surgery yesterday. So a lot of surgeries and procedures of people, and so far, things are going well in the ones that have had them, but we've got more to get procedures and surgeries, and certainly those that are already having things can get better still than where they are. Anybody else or anything else that we should be mindful of as we go to prayer? Yeah.
One of my friends, his coworker's 16-year-old niece just got diagnosed with leukemia.
That's tough. Always at any age, but 16 years old, tough.
Jerry Wallace had knee surgery yesterday.
Okay. Jerry Wallace, knee surgery. Anything else? All right, if you bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful to be here and to study your word. We're grateful for this opportunity to speak to you. We have so many on our hearts and mind. The long list that we've just gone over of people that need you for healing purposes. We're thankful for those that have gone through some procedures, and at least at this point, things have gone well and they're recovering well. We ask that continue for them. Those that have not had procedures yet, we pray that those will go well for them. That those will address their issues and allow them to return to the health that they desire, and give them a chance to get back with their loved ones and hopefully back with us in worship. We pray for that. We pray for the many that weren't on that list, but we know of in our hearts, minds, we're also on our daily prayer list. We ask you to be with them as well and meet their needs as fits your will. We know of others that have lost loved ones recently, and we know that's something that the people don't get over quickly. And we ask you to give them comfort and strength and help us to be a strength to them as well. And people that are going through other difficulties in their lives at this particular point, we ask you to be with them. We're mindful of missionaries around the world. The ones that we support obviously are top of our mind, but all of them we hope that they keep safe and healthy and that have great success in your kingdom. We ask you to be with governments around the world, that be such that it not hinder your kingdom's growth. We ask that you be with your church leadership here and around the world, and we ask always for your guidance as we go through this class and as we go through lives. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So dreams and visions. I won't ask how many of you had dreams because I don't want to hear about them, but anyway, we'll talk about the ones we looked at last week. So summary, we started off last week talking about Joseph, and now we have a situation where multiple dreams happen to the same person. So in this case, Joseph had two different dreams. Now Joseph, to set it up, if we've forgotten, Joseph is the favorite son of his father. He in turn, because of that in lots of ways, if you're the favorite son by the parents, that tends to make you less favored by your siblings, and that's certainly the case with his brothers. At least the 10 older ones there hate him just because of that relationship. So he dreams that his brothers will bow down to him, that they're sheaves of wheat, and they all bow down to his sheaf of wheat. And that didn't help things relationship-wise. They hate him even the more after they hear that. Then he dreams that the whole family bows down to him. He dreams that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all bow down to him. And so now they envy him. They want to, would like to be in that role and have that position where they believe that the rest of the family is going to be beneath them, if you will. But what is the father? The father, while he rebukes him a little bit about it, he keeps it in mind. We said it's a lot like Mary keeping in mind what Jesus did. He's got a very interesting perspective on it because what? We've already studied. He had a dream from God. And so he knows how that can be. And so he doesn't dismiss it totally out of hand. He doesn't think it's something maybe he should have shared and how it, made his brothers feel, but he certainly keeps it in mind because he knows how it worked out for him, and I'm sure he thinks about how it might work out for Joseph. Then we turn to the fact that Joseph's brothers, envy, hatred, all turns into a situation where they think about killing him, but ultimately sell him off into slavery. It gets there. He goes through a situation with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. He ends up in the prison where the king's prisoners go to, and he gets to where he's favored there because God's looking out for him, and so he gets in a position of being able to be in charge of prisoners as they're put into it. Prisoners basically directed to be there by Pharaoh or somebody high up in the government. And so at that time, both the butler and the baker for the Pharaoh anger him. We don't know why that was so. We don't know anything about what angered him enough to send them both in there. A lot of speculation that there was a coup attempt, or at least a plan for that, and he thought both of them were involved in that. Both of them would have opportunities to kill him. The butler is sometimes called the cupbearer, so he would be the one to bring drinks to the Pharaoh. Easy to slip in poison into that. The baker would actually provide the food, so again, an opportunity to get close and to be able to take care of him. And we said these are not your normal menial type of positions. These are really important positions. They're almost offices in the government because of that close relationship with Pharaoh himself. So they're not like the servants, as we might sometimes think. They're basically positions to be held. But somehow they angered him, and so he imprisoned them. Surprise, right there where Joseph's in charge of the prisoners, because even though he's a prisoner, anything he touches and anything he does is blessed, and so the captain of the guard there, some think it's Potiphar, I don't think so, but some captain of the guard puts him in charge of all the other prisoners. So he gets a chance to interact with them. And so he notices one day that both of them have a different countenance. They're both sad. And so he asks, why are these men sad? And so they ultimately said, we've had dreams. Both of us have had a dream last night, different dreams. They're not the same dream, but we have no idea what these dreams mean, and we don't have anybody that can interpret those things for us. And so Joseph says, I'll do it. Now we know he dreamed. We also know that he was sharp enough to understand the dreams that he had, although they seem pretty obvious when you read the dreams he had with regards to his family to kind of, okay, that makes sense, that's what that is. But he believes that all interpretations come from God, and he believes that God's going to work through him to potentially interpret their dreams. So he volunteers to do that. So the butler provides his dream. His dream is all about a grapevine growing up and clusters of grape and getting it squeezed out and ultimately putting it in Pharaoh's cup and handing it to Pharaoh. And so the dream is interpreted by Joseph, by God's revelation to him. It says, okay, you had 3 branches, that's 3 days. All this means you're going to get your job back in 3 days. Pharaoh is going to put you back in the role that you held before. And so, sounds great. So the baker says, hey, that was a good one. I'll tell him about mine. So the baker's dream, he says, okay, this is what happened in my dream. I got these 3 baskets, put them up there, and birds all come and devour those. I don't know what he thought that was going to be, how that was going to come out good for him, but it wasn't good for him. Again, 3 days, but in this case, you're going to have your head lifted off your body. You're going to be beheaded as the role that Pharaoh is going to take it. And certainly the interpretations come through. In 3 days, the butler is returned to his position in Pharaoh's entourage, and the baker is beheaded, and then his body is hung up in addition to that, a real insult to him entirely. Now, Joseph had told the butler, who knew he was going to live for a while, hey, remember me when you get in there and tell Pharaoh about the fact that I interpreted your dream for you, made you understand that. Let him know that when you get into that position. But it says the butler forgot. It's kind of hard to believe he actually forgot. I think more likely he thought there wasn't anything to be gained from his benefit, only a risk again if he explained it any further, and just didn't accept what happened to himself. So he didn't bother to tell Pharaoh about what happened. And so we had 2 dreams for Joseph. Now we have 2 dreams for 2 different men or officers basically in Pharaoh's household. And that's where most of what we got. We'll talk about where we started up with Pharaoh himself in just a little bit. Any comments about the discussions last week? All right, we turn to Pharaoh then in Genesis chapter 41. So in chapter 41, verses 1 through 4, we found out that 2 years later, so 2 years have gone by since the butler has been restored to his position and the baker has been killed, Pharaoh has a dream. And his dream has him beside the Nile. We said that's what the river is, and everybody would understand that. And it has initially a dream of 7 cows coming out, really good-looking cows, fat cows, well-taken care of cows from that. They go and feed on the meadow. And then 7 other cows come up out of the river as well. These are not good-looking cows. They look pretty bad. They're ugly and very thin, and yet when they come out, they eat up the 7 fat cows. And by the way, they don't look any better for it. It's not like they just ate a fat cow, they should be that big. No, they're just as gaunt as they were before they did it. They don't look good at all. So not surprisingly, that's pretty much seems to me to be a nightmare. And for Pharaoh, that means he woke up. So he woke up to that one. You think, well, maybe he can't go ahead and go back to sleep. Well, he does. He goes back to sleep and he dreams yet another dream. This time, it's about grain. So 7 heads of grain come up on a stalk. That's how grain is out there, is the heads or parts that actually turn into what we feed animals, or we may find their cereal or bread or whatever. And so 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk. They were like those first cows were. They're nice, fat, plump, look really good. And then behold, another comes up, and there's 7 heads, thin, don't look good at all. They're blighted by the east wind. And those 7 thin heads devour the 7 plump heads, full heads, and again, no profit out of that one from there. And we talked about the east wind is interestingly enough used by God fairly frequently to do something. It is what he used to bring the locusts as a part of the plague. It is what he used to make life miserable for Jonah when he was unhappy as he sat there by Nineveh. And so it's constantly something that's mentioned or used in a negative way. And the only time we ever see a west wind is when the locusts are taken out of Egypt from that. So that was interesting to me anyway. So Pharaoh's had 2 dreams, like Joseph had 2 dreams, like the combination of the 2 officers had 2 dreams. So it's 2, 2, 2 in a lot of ways from that. So now Pharaoh's awoken, he's realized he's had 2 dreams. I would call them 2 nightmares. Nothing pleasant about those dreams at all. You can't come out with the butler's ending from that. So this is where we got to last week. So now, starting in verse 8 of chapter 41 of Genesis. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. The nightmares are bothering him. He knows they're meaning something. I mean, there's a lot of consistencies between those 2, for one thing. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. He's bringing everybody together that some way has somewhat what people would think of mystical powers, with the hope that they have the ability to interpret. This comes back, we'll see it again with Daniel, right? When he gets to do it. When all of them are called in to try to interpret the dreams of the kings at that point in time. And Pharaoh told him his dreams. So different than what happens with one of the kings with Daniel. Pharaoh does tell him what the dreams were. But there was no one who could interpret them from Pharaoh. Now, I don't know if they couldn't interpret them at all, because these are men who usually tried to trick you anyway. That's what their magic was about, was pulling a fast one on you, like magic is today. So I suspect that, there's a likelihood they came up with something, but it wasn't believable to Pharaoh. Now, maybe God made it so they couldn't even come up with a good story to tell. I don't know. But they didn't do anything that was an actual interpretation, and Pharaoh knew they didn't interpret that. And so no one could interpret them. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. Now the butler remembers something he promised to a person who had done a big service for him. That was interpreting his dream to let him know what was about to come and what was very positive for his life from that. And he's not had a second thought about Joseph at all. So he says, I remember my faults. I did something wrong, Pharaoh. I'm going to admit it. I don't know what Pharaoh thought about it when he said that, what he expected out of that, but probably not what it turned out to be. And starting verse 10. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants, this is the butler speaking, and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. You remember back then when you were mad at both of us? You put us in prison? That's when I'm going back. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Let me explain, in case you got confused, it's both me and that chief baker had dreams. Don't want you to get that missed. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Each of them were different. Our dreams were different, had different interpretations, but we both dreamed that same one singular night. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us, there. Identifies nationality, different from what you're listening to right now. A servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. Didn't say that he asked to, he didn't say that he claimed to be able to interpret them. We just told him to him, and he interpreted them for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. So each person got their own interpretation. Okay, and what happened? And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, just like he told us they would turn out, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. He being Pharaoh. I don't want to call him he in this case. That's what you did, basically, was what I would have said. You restored me to my office, and you hanged him. But nonetheless, he explains that's the two dreams we had. And those dreams were interpreted that way, and that's exactly how things happen. Exact way that this Hebrew man told us there. So he's setting up a case that there is somebody that potentially Pharaoh can interpret your dreams. I know because I've seen it happen. I've experienced it. He was able to interpret my dream, and not only that, he interpreted the sheep acres, and they were right spot on as to what he said that would happen. So I'm letting you know about this guy. So then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. He's looking forward to it. Nobody can do it. This is a glimmer of hope that he's going to understand these nightmarish dreams he's had. So he sends off for Joseph. Now, he can't worthily come into Pharaoh's presence because not much good happens hygiene-wise in the dungeon, in prison. So they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. I suspect there was a bath involved, but I don't know. They didn't mention it, but I would hope so. If anything, I don't think the clothes would be all the smell that we'd have to take care of. But in any case, he had to be put in a presentable state before he could come up to Pharaoh, even for the purposes of interpreting this dream for him. And so all that happens to Joseph before he comes. Think about how Joseph must have felt. It's been 2 years. Nothing's happened to you. You don't necessarily, I don't know if they told you what's going on, but suddenly you're getting shaved and cleaned up and new clothes, and you're off to see Pharaoh. You know, it's off to see the wizard or something like Wizard of Oz. I hope that I get a wish that I want. He's probably excited about that one. So in verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. Nobody I thought would do it, nobody that supposedly has qualifications to interpret it, has been successful from that. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. He puts enough faith. Again, let's remind ourselves, the butler isn't the servant that you think he is. He is an officer. He is somebody of prominence in order to have that close a relationship to Pharaoh to be able to give him his cup. So it's not like, you know, the butlers we see on TV from that, who's just a servant. Sometimes they're friends with the people, but most of the time they're just seen as a menial deal. That's why he trusted what the butler told him from that, and made that kind of deal. And also his desperation to get an interpretation for it. So verse 16, so Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. I'm not going to take credit for this, Pharaoh. It is not me that makes the interpretation. It's not in me to individually do this. I don't have an innate talent of my own. God will give Pharaoh an answer peace. So he's basically saying, I'm not the one that's going to do it. He may work through me, but ultimately if there's an interpretation to give to you, Pharaoh, it's going to come from God. And he will give you that answer and give you some peace, comfort, in understanding what the message is of your dreams. And so Pharaoh will tell him his dreams, starting in verse 17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Again, he doesn't have to say what river it is. Everybody knows. It's the Nile. That's the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have not seen in all the land of Egypt. See, we have a lot more carrying out about this one here than we had it explained to begin with. He's a lot more affected by how they look now. And he said, and the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, and when they'd eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. And I talked about the fact that that's the outcome of it, but notice it didn't get said the first time. When he dreamed it, when we just record the dream, it doesn't talk about the fact that when he ate them, or when they ate the fat cows, that there was no change in the countenance, the way that those gaunt cows looked. They still looked just as bad as before. And he explains, I woke up after that. think we all would kind of wake up after that. Not a pleasant situation. I mean, carnivores, are one thing. Cannibals is another thing. I don't know. Cows eating cows is, really out there somewhere because they don't even eat meat. That just seems really bizarre to have. And so ugly cows clearly left a big impression with him. So he goes on. Also, I saw in my dream, indicating it carries on. He had already said he woke up, but he sees it kind of as a continuation even somewhat himself. He says, also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. So again, explains it with a little bit more description to someone just how bad things were or good were with the different heads. And he explains to it, nobody's been able to explain it. I turn to the people who should be the experts in this. Nobody can give me anything. So that's the state I sit in, Joseph. These are the dreams I had. No satisfaction as to what they mean. So that's where you step in, Joseph. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, and we don't know, did he say it immediately? God gave it to him then? Did he take some time? We don't know. All we know is he spoke back to Pharaoh anyway, and he said, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. You had 2 dreams, but the message is one, basically, is what he's saying to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. He's giving you a view of the future, Pharaoh. You're seeing what's going to happen after this in the future. God's given that to you. The 7 good cows are 7 years. So that's what the cows represent. Each one of them is a year out there. These are going to be good years from that. And the dreams are 1. And the 7 thin and ugly cows, which came up after them, are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blotted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. So now we know the difference. What's good years and what's bad years? The bad year is about famine, not being able to produce enough crops. Famine doesn't necessarily mean zero. Doesn't mean you don't get anything out of it. It just means you're far less than what it takes to subsist. It's not enough for what you need out of it from that. And that's what's going to happen. And again, we've got that east wind. That's an important part, clearly, because it's mentioned in both instances of relating the dreams. This is one thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh about what he is about to do. That's what Joseph said before he interpreted it, and that's what he says afterwards. Pay attention, Pharaoh. God's trying to emphasize to you what's going to happen now in the future. He didn't want you to miss this. He's given you 2 dreams to emphasize this is what's going to happen in the future. He's giving you fair warning about what's going to happen for you to be able to act on that. Now that's the interpretation of the dream, right? Joseph's given the interpretation, but Joseph's not going to stop there from that. He's going to go into a little bit more details about it, and ultimately, he's going to tell him what he should do about it. So he goes on in verse 29. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. Guess what? It won't just happen in Egypt, right? The whole situation is much more spread out than that. Thus, it will affect the land of Canaan, which will be what happens down the road with Joseph and his father and the other brothers. But after them 7 years of famine will rise. Again, that happens all around. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. Guess what? And the plenty will be forgotten elsewhere too. And the famine will deplete the land. It's going to take it because we're not going to have anything to do. It's going to be hard on the land itself because it's not producing enough stuff to even work really good for fertilizing crops in the future from that. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. Don't kid yourself. This isn't just one of those limited famines that, you get 75% of the normal crop. This is going to be a big famine. It's really going to be bad for you. And it's going to be severe from that. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. I think this is true, even though it hadn't been stated, of when Joseph had 2 dreams. I think that was just as true then. Why did God show him 2 dreams about his relationship to his family? Because the thing is established by God. It's going to happen. It's a done deal. And because the thing will be brought to pass by God relatively shortly. It was only a few years. He was 17 when he went. A couple of years that being in there in the prison and stuff. It's not that long since he had the dreams. and it won't be that long till his family shows up from that. So I think that's basically true of both situations. That's why you see them twice, in both with what Joseph saw and now what Pharaoh sees. God wants him to know it's established. It's a done deal by God. You're not going to change that, and it will come to pass in a fairly short period of time. Now Joseph's going to go into advising beyond, maybe, I don't know whether God's giving him this inspiration or it's just him, but he's going beyond the interpretation now. He's interpreted what this means. You're going to have 7 really good years. You're going to have 7 really bad years. He could have said, all right, I'm done. I did what you asked me to do. I gave you the interpretation of Scripture, or of dreams, rather. But Joseph either chooses or God directs him not to stop there. And that's key, obviously, to God's plan, as we know, as we give what he's going to say. So Joseph says, starting in verse 33, "Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt." Get somebody that really knows what they're doing, that's going to make smart decisions, direct activities, take control of things here in Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Now, does that mean that the land can produce the other 2/7? Well, keep in mind, are the other, other fifths, the other 4/5 of the produce, they lived on less. I'm sure they lived on less. We don't know how much they could produce, but 1/5, then go handling the others. I don't know if that's what they're going to live on. 4/5, those first 7 years, and only 1/5 later on. Like I said, famine doesn't mean a total non-production. It just means severely less than it was before from that. So he's kind of directed a plan here, right? And he goes on with it. He says, "And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming," that 1/5 every year, "and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities." So store it in the cities where the people are. Put it there, not out in the country from that where I have to go get it or something. "Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine." So Joseph said, I've told you what's going to happen. You're going to have 7 really good years of crops. You're going to have 7 very bad years. Now, I could leave you at that, and you have no plan to what am I going to do with that information, but I'm going to carry it on and tell you what you do with that. You find a good, discerning, wise person to be in charge. You put lieutenants under them to be able to carry it out over the land of Egypt. You take and get 1/5, a specific amount, of the crops and put them somewhere to store them away so that you've got them for the 7 bad years that are going to come from that. And therefore, you'll be able to make it through. Egypt will be able to persevere through the 7 years of really severe famine from that. So he provides that advice to Pharaoh from that. Did he do it self-seeking from that? I doubt it. I don't really know that he thought that. Again, was that led by the Holy Spirit, by God to say that? We don't know. We know what he said. But he didn't say, hey, it's me. Pick me, pick me, pick me. I'm that discerning man. But he told him what he should do in general from that. Now, we had some questions last week because we hadn't even got to this point, but wanted to know about the grain, right? So there was one to begin with. I think your son actually came up with this one first. Could the grain have lasted for the time saved? So you're getting 1/5 of the grain, and you're saving it over those 7 years, right? You get 1/5 every year from that. So if you store it away separately and you use it every year, you're only going to have grain that's been in storage for 7 years. So it's not like you went, a bunch of years, but it's 7 years, you use the 1/5 from the first year. 7 years to go down. So that's the time period we'd be looking at it being able to be stored from that. So that's the question. Would it stay good for that period of time? The answer is there's no clear answer. Experts kind of disagree one way or the other about it. Now, there are some benefits to it being in Egypt. Egypt is very much a part of pretty much the desert. It is a very dry land for the most part, thus the importance of the Nile as a part of that. So if you visited Egypt, you've seen that. You've seen that in pictures. Pyramids are not sitting there in a green set of land. There's not a bunch of trees around blocking the view of the pyramids. They're out there in the sand dunes. That's the way it is. That's why you can ride your camel. Well, I didn't ride my camel, but I rode my horse up there anyway. Sat on a camel by the pyramids, but I didn't ride the camel up to there. But anyway, that's why it's that way. So that would help. That would help. So there's, like I say, no clear answer. Some people think that, some experts say it can be for, long periods of time. Some people say a few years, less than 7 it could be. Other people say, yeah, 7's more than fine. So I can't say, I'm not going to say absolutely either way. Their main 2 crops, when we talk about grains, were wheat and barley. Wheat's much more likely to be able to stay for longer periods of time than barley is. Barley is a lot more volatile to spoilage from that. So there's no clear answer whether it could do it naturally. Obviously, God could have interceded. So whether naturally it could go for that period of time, God could intercede it. All we know is it did. Right? There's no argument that it did. We just don't know for sure why it did. Yeah. Guy.
My Bible, King James Version, says corn.
Yeah, it uses the word corn as the way they describe it, but actuality, it wasn't usually very much corn, and most of them think, and that's why a lot of the other translations translate it to grain instead of saying corn from that, is it was not likely to be corn. The more likely things were. But corn would be the same. Corn can stay, again, somewhat the same kind of time period as wheat from that way.
I've raised corn, but I've raised rice and soybeans, and you can tell it, but basically for a year.
Yeah, that's where most of them look like for a year. And again, it's a controlled environment and all of that. But like I said, you have the benefit of it being very dry, non-arid environment, which is a plus for it. And that'll get us to the other question you had was, what about the grain fermenting in the silos? And that kind of comes back to the fact it's a very dry, moisture-free environment. And to ferment, you got to have a considerable amount of moisture involved in that process. So not very likely that the wheat can obviously ferment, but not likely to ferment in those silos because there isn't enough moisture to induce fermentation for that. So again, all we do know is that it did last. Whether that was totally feasible without God's intervention, I can't tell you for certain. There's indications it could be, and that it wouldn't be illogical for it to do that, but certainly God can make whatever we wanted to happen, happen. We can say that additionally, we don't have at least any record that Pharaoh said, wait a minute, that won't work. Now, first of all, he wanted a plan, and I'm sure he didn't want to come up with that plan, so maybe he bought into it from that, but we don't get any pushback of anybody challenging in the reality of being able to have grain good for 7 years. So that's the best I can do with those questions. But I did pay attention. See, I do try to answer people's questions, even if I fail in the answers. All right. So, starting in verse 37 then. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh. I mean, after all, he didn't even know what the dreams meant. Now he's got somebody who's trying to give him an answer to it, and it does seem to have some logic, right? It makes kind of sense. If you're going to have good years, then you got to kind of use that to offset the bad years. You can't say, well, just eat more of those years, and hopefully you're fat enough you're going to make it those other 7 years if you eat a lot. That's not a good plan from it. So he liked the plan. It made sense to Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. Now, again, keep in mind that a lot of what we're talking about servants there, again, are not these lowly people, indentured people, slaves or whatever. A lot of them are more like officers. They are close to the Pharaoh. They're not just menial servants. So when he says his servants thought it made sense, it's kind of like his officers thought it made sense. So keep that in mind from there. And Pharaoh said to his servants, again, he's asking something from them, not what you would do from, your hired hands kind of things. He says to them, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? So he says to them, could we find any person better to fulfill the role that Joseph has very, much laid out for us, and we all agree makes sense for this wise and discerning man to look out for this plan from that? Is there really anybody else out there? I mean, he puts the Spirit of God, not appreciating, Joseph's God, but God in general. Why? Because nobody else could interpret his dreams. If nothing else, he would see him as having the Spirit of God if that's where he'd stopped. Because Joseph's interpretation makes a lot of sense. Pharaoh can see it. It doesn't seem like something that just got made up. It makes a lot of sense that you're talking about a famine after 7 good years from that. And so he says, he's given us a plan, and who's the best one to execute this plan? Seems to me that the guy we just heard it from, he's the best one to do that. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this. Now notice, when Joseph started to do that, what did Joseph tell him about the interpretation of the dream? It's not me. You get an interpretation of it, it's God. God's going to give me the interpretation, and I'll give it to you. And, that's the way we need to do a lot of things with people. Put it very out front. If I'm doing this, if this is going to be successful, it's going to be God that made it successful. Now I'm going to try to carry it out. But it's God that's going to make it successful. And then you turn around when you get to that point and you get Pharaoh giving those words back to him. Because God has shown you all this, then there's no one as wise and discerning and wise as you. Now you see, God's gotten the credit. Joseph said that should get the credit, and Pharaoh's giving him the credit for that. And I think that's a lesson we can learn a lot of times. We try to take too much credit, and then we try to give it to God. You give it to God before you do the thing, which is what Joseph did. Before he gave the interpretation, you go afterwards and say, well, that actually was an interpretation I got from God. He said beforehand, if you're going to get one, it's going to come from God. It's just going to come through me. And thus, like I said, Pharaoh credits God and then says, you're the means by which God has provided that, but God is the one that did it, and you're discerning and wise. And so because of that, verse 40, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Now, in reality, this has been the situation with Joseph now 3 times, right? He went into Potiphar's household, and what was it? And what was his ultimate amount of authority in Potiphar's house? He was over everything in Potiphar's house. Joseph said, the only thing I'm not over is you, Potiphar's wife, when you're trying to seduce me. Everything else is under my control because God's blessing me, and therefore he blesses whatever I touch. Potiphar's seen it, and I'm now in charge. He gets sent to prison. What does the captain of the guard do? Puts him in charge of everybody else and what goes on in the prison. Why? Because God's blessing him, and therefore everything happens positively, good for the prison and obviously for the prison guard, the captain of the guard from that. So this is the 3rd time somebody who's in power to a certain level has turned over that role to Joseph. He's not unfamiliar with getting that handed down to him. Obviously, it's gotten a lot bigger. You could argue it's gotten bigger all along in some ways. Maybe with Potiphar's house, he had money, investments, and stuff like that to take care of that he didn't in prison. But in prison, he had more people that he was in charge of. Now he's over the whole of Egypt and all this collection that's going to go on from that. And, much like it was with Potiphar, Pharaoh draws a line merely at saying, only with regards to the throne. When we're making royal decisions, when it comes down to those kind of things that represent the kingdom, I am going to be greater than you. Otherwise, the day-to-day activities, I'm not greater than you. You can execute those things. You're in charge. It's your show. Yeah, Justin.
I think it's interesting what you just said about Joseph's life, how he was, at certain points he was second in command over everything, and at some points he had nothing. And while obviously Pharaoh thought he gave God the credit to make him a wise and discernible person, there was no better person to foresee this effort than somebody like Joseph, who has literally been through his own periods of plenty and periods of famine in his life. So who better to keep that course and actually follow through with this plan? Because I'm sure it would have been easy by year 3 or 4 in the middle of the plenty to be like, we're doing great. Maybe those years of famine aren't really coming, and maybe
we'll have a big party.
Yeah, maybe we'll just have a party. We won't take the 5th this year or something like that. It would have been very easy to do that. But somebody like Joseph, who has had his, I've been on top and I've been at the bottom. I know how quickly that can turn. That made Joseph the perfect person to do this, honestly. It was almost like God was preparing him specifically for this role.
Yeah, God had said it all into it. Pharaoh had no way of knowing that when he agreed to it. All Pharaoh acted on was, you just interpreted my dreams and gave me a very logical and feasible plan for dealing with it. But you're right, Joseph's life, in the fact that he would go in those ups and downs to it, from being at the low, he's sitting in the bottom of a well, he's a slave, then he becomes in charge of the household, then he's falsely accused, he's put in prison, so he's, in chains or whatever, then he does well enough to impress that he gets put in charge of all those. He has had those ups and downs to see what the feelings of, like you said, those years of none and years of plenty, and help him to keep a focus on that for the 7 good years, so they can handle the 7 bad years. Because 7 years, and you're starting to go, really? Is that famine coming? I mean, I don't know. It seems like it's going really well. Maybe it's not going to happen, and maybe it's not that bad. You know, that would be a tendency, and it would be a tendency, I think, of virtually anybody else that got put into that job. If it wasn't Joseph, who knew those were the words of God, that was his prophecy, anybody else gets kind of that inherited thing, and their level of commitment to it, short of Pharaoh directing him to it, would not be as strong as it would be for Joseph, both in his being the interpreter and the experiences he'd had to that point. But I do think God, you know, had a purpose in those other two events that happened in his life, the Potiphar's household and the prison. There's a reason for those things. And I do believe that it has, from my personal perspective, has a lot to do with preparing him for the role he's going to play now. Just as it was to see now, you know, see that dream early on and know that's kind of where he's got to go. To keep that hope all the time of knowing at some point God's directed that I'm somehow going to get in a position where my brothers are going to bow down to me. Certainly doesn't seem like that here in prison. You know, it doesn't seem like that when I'm Potiphar's house and I'm just one of his slaves. But I've always got that vision to go to because God's provided it to me from that. And somehow that's going to happen. So God did a lot of preparing Joseph. He went through a lot to get where he was and be ready to be the right man to execute that job. I think very definitely so. All right, verse 41 through 44. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand, which was his signal paperwork and stuff like that of the royalists, and set out a royal decree kind of thing, and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck, which we find to be a very frequent sign of, you know, being in power from that. Gold chains are often what we see in the Bible and in historical documents from that. And he had him ride in the second chariot, not up in his chariot, but the second chariot, the one behind him, in which he had, and they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." Now, is there any question whether Joseph's in charge? No. He's following Pharaoh, and people are yelling out as he goes by, "You bow the knee to this man." The message was made very clear to everybody in the kingdom, Joseph's in charge besides me. He's number two to me, that's why he's in that second chariot, but you're going to bow the knee to him. You're going to do what he says from that. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." There's nothing people can do without your permission, Joseph. And I'm giving you that authority, passing it down from me being Pharaoh. I can give you that power. I can make that happen. And so that's the outcome of his dream, right? Now, notice Joseph acknowledging God's role in that. And later on in Genesis chapter 45, and he's meeting with his brothers, in the whole situation that we kind of talked about how he got prepared from that, his brothers are obviously very concerned once they get to find out who he is when they're there to get some of that grain because of the famine. So in chapter 45, verse 5, writes, "But now," this is Joseph speaking, "do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." So Joseph says, and I don't know if they really would feel grieved other than, like I said, they're now in fear of their own lives. I don't know how much guilt they felt for selling their brother. Reuben may have, but the rest of them, I'm not sure. But in any case, he said, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because, why? Because God is the one that sent me here before you came so that I could preserve life, including yours. But I'm here to preserve a lot of lives. And God sent me here for a reason. You may have, not done the right thing, but God's turned it into the well thing. He said then in 50 verse 20, after his father has died and his brothers are now really worried again, Joseph's been nice to us, but that was when Dad was alive. Now that he's not, is he going to take it out on us for the fact we sold him? He has to again assure them. So he says in verse 20 of chapter 50, "But as for you, my brothers, you meant evil against me." No question. They were going to go ahead and kill him at one point. "But God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive." Joseph always perceived that it was more than him just doing enough to be able to save his own family. He didn't set that up. He didn't even know that expectation when he told Pharaoh about it. We don't get any feeling that he thought about Canaan. All he knew was what was going to happen in Egypt itself. and give out the directive of how to do this so that Egypt survived those 7 years of famine. He says, you didn't plan for it this way, but God meant it for good. We have those situations in our lives where we'll go, this is not good. This is a horrible situation. And I'm sure Joseph thought that a lot of times. He did have those, he had those two dreams that said someday you're going to have a position of power to kind of encourage him. You, me, we all have that promise of eternity with God, no matter how difficult it comes in this life and whether it ever gets better in this life. He had that hope that someday he was going to be put in a position where the rest bowed down to him. And so when he gets to this point, he said, you thought it was bad. God always intended something good to come from this. He gave me the experiences to do this well. He put me in the positions to get here. If I hadn't been sold into slavery, I wouldn't be in charge of Egypt. If I hadn't gone into Potiphar's house, I would have ended up in the prison where the king or the Pharaoh put his prisoners in. And if his wife hadn't have tried to seduce me and I turned that down, I wouldn't have ended up in that prison. And if I hadn't been, faithful there and God blessed me there, I wouldn't have been in a position to talk to those two men, the butler and baker, and give them their interpretations. And if I hadn't been in that position, if God hadn't got it to where it came up for it, interpretation needed to be had, and the butler finally remembers me. All this stuff, God made it work out. Now, Joseph, I didn't have any of these plans. I never would have expected. It wouldn't have been me to say, hey, let me go be sold into slavery. Don't let me go and work in this household and be, have false statements made against me. Don't have me in a prison. But it all worked out the way God wanted to do. And therefore, I'm able to save many people. Egyptians, Canaanites, all around the area are there because God put me in this position and gave me the ability to interpret the dreams to where we can do the things to get around these 7 days of famine. So, Joseph's always very good, like he was with Pharaoh when he went to do the interpretation. It's God. And Joseph said, I didn't make this better. I didn't make this turn out right. God's always had a good plan at it. All things work together for good, right? All right. Now, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, went throughout all the land of Egypt. That's 46. Just put that in there for you to get a perspective. When he got sold into slavery, he was, do you remember how old? He was 17. He was a teenager. It's only 13 years later, but it's been a hard 13 years. 13 years later, now he's finally fulfilling the dreams he had as a 17-year-old. 13 years of going through difficulty, like the people of Israel for 400 years under the bondage of Egypt before their promise came true. So that's how long it's been, if you wondered from that. So we got our general questions to ask ourselves. Who had the dream and vision? In this case, it's Pharaoh. Most powerful man in Egypt is the one who had the dream or dreams. The situation when it occurred, well, there really wasn't much of a situation going on at the time. It was one about the future, so it wasn't too much about what was going on right then and there. Joseph was still in prison. The butler had not told Pharaoh about the fact that Joseph had given him an interpretation that was accurate to get out of there. So when it happened, that was going to be God's way to execute his plan, the next step for Joseph. What was the content of the dream and the vision? Well, basically, it was in two cases to be able to explain that there's going to be 7 years of great crops, bumper crops, extra food, and then there's going to be followed by 7 very severe years of famine. And the whole message behind that is you got to figure out a way to be prepared. You got some opportunity. I've given you a heads up. You're going to have 7 really good years. You better use those wisely, because after that, you're going to have some 7 very miserable years from that. And we know how miserable they were. They were so miserable. At the end of that 7 years, what did Pharaoh own? Everything and everybody. Everything and everybody. They started out buying the food, and then they didn't have any more money. And then they sold their animals, traded them in, and then they didn't have any more animals. And then they traded in their land until they had no more land. And then basically they traded in themselves. At the end of the 7 years, Pharaoh owned everything. So it definitely worked out for Pharaoh from that. What was the purpose of the dream and the vision? Well, it was to carry out God's plan in a lot of different ways, right? He wanted to keep things going in that. He fulfilled the dreams that he had given to Joseph by putting him in a position of power. And ultimately, as we'll see, that also was a way, for the next phase in God's plan for his people. Because when it comes time for, Joseph's family to come and get fed from that, it's also time for them to come and live in Egypt and to start getting close to that 400 years that they're going to be in bondage before they can have the promised land. So it's God's mechanism for getting them out of the promised land so that they can fulfill the time period, and those nations, most importantly, in the promised land get to go to where they sin so much that that's what's going to happen. In fact, I was reading in my nightly reading, where Moses talked about it. That's the reason. You didn't earn this land. I'm not giving it to you. They did so badly that I'm wiping them out, and you get to take over because of that. That's why you're getting the land, because they were so sinful from that. So he's got to give them those years on their own, not influencing God's people for them to do that. But he's got to get all of God's people, not a big group at this point, but get them into Egypt to get the next phase of God's plan. His promise is carried out from that. And that's how it figured into God's plan. Other comments or questions?
Even after his brothers had sold him and treated him so badly.
Yep.
But he had compassion on them and showed kindness to them.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, after all the stuff he went through. Now, at this point, life's pretty good. He got married off to the high priest's daughter, and he's had kids, and, he's living a position of power. But nonetheless, I'd feel bitter, and he doesn't. He just shows compassion to his brothers from that.
People can treat us badly sometimes, but we win when we show compassion and kindness.
That's right. And then sometimes that's really hard for them to believe, but that's what affects people, is that we're different from the rest of the world. His brothers had a hard time believing he had that compassion, really. They thought that was an act put on for their dad while he was still alive. But it was really how he wanted to be. Guy, you had something you want to say?
I'm interested in the idea, what is God's plan today? Because we don't have miracles. We don't have all the things that God did back then and when Jesus was on earth. What is it now?
Well, God's...
The New Testament.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah. We've got the New Testament, and we don't have those miracles, we don't do things like that, but we have like the Holy Spirit indwelling us that helps us in a lot of ways, just like it helps us, as I think I mentioned on Sunday, to be able to pray, because we don't know what we're to pray for. We don't, we need guidance from that. I think somewhat it works through our conscience and other types of things, but God doesn't act the same way, but he still acts to get us to that promised land.
God's plan is to follow his word.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And get to that ultimate, and get to the ultimate promised land, right?
Yeah.
You gonna say something else? Okay. Anything else? All right. We're going to move on to the Midianites. So in chapter 7 of Judges is the next time we pick up a dream. Now the situation is, as you know, if Judges, book of Judges is all about what happens after the Israelites gain their land, and they've been led when they did by Joshua after Moses was not allowed to enter, and Moses appealed to God to put somebody in charge. Joshua was put in charge. And as we talked about on Sunday morning, the people did really good while Joshua was alive. And while the elders, the people that were older during that time and that lived through all the wonderful things that God did miraculously and appreciated those things, they did really well. As soon as that was not the case, they got into sinning. And so the book of Judges is that constant repeating theme of the people going away from God, worshiping other gods, adding them to their worship, maybe trying to include God, but with every other god that's out there, rebelling from him and showing all sorts of types of sin, God getting angry with them, giving up on them, sending somebody in to conquer them or to put them under their rule, make life difficult for them. At some point, the Israelites would realize, this isn't good. How do we get out of this? Okay, let's appeal to God, the God that we really know, the God that took us out of Egypt from that. And they will appeal to him. God will feel sorry for them and have his love for them, and he will give them somebody to rescue them out of that case that we call a judge. Not like we think a judge with a gavel going down, but most of the time more like a leader, a military leader. Yes, did decisions and stuff after that, but kind of was the person who kind of led the nation for that. And they would be good until that person died, and right after that person died, right back to the same cycle. Away from God, to all the gods around him, make him mad, get conquered by somebody, cry out to God, he'd give him, feel sorry at some point, give him another judge, and so on we go. So in Judges, by reach chapter 7, we get to a judge that's going to be chosen by God, not somebody that we choose normally, a guy by the name of Gideon. Gideon is part of one of the lowliest tribes. He's as low as they go in that. It's kind of the bottom of the rung of anybody you would choose to be in charge. And God chooses him. And Gideon is, a doubter. He is probably one of the biggest doubters of the Old Testament. So he puts God to the test a couple times to say, are you really wanting me to do this? Are you with me, okay? So you've got the famous fleece part. Put the fleece out. And the first time he said, okay, God, bring dew down everywhere except on the fleece. So everything goes on that way, wakes up the next day, everything's wet around that, and the fleece is as dry as it can be. He's not satisfied, so he said, hey, God, I know you like that one. I don't want to make you mad, but I want another sign. So this time I'm going to put the fleece out, let it be the only thing that's wet, and everything else around it be dry. And so God says, okay. He puts up with him. There's a lot of patience he shows with Gideon, and he does that. So there's water, you just wring out water from the fleece, and the ground itself is dry. So Gideon is not totally sold still on what God's asked him to do. The Midianites have come in to take over and be that difficult people in the land from that. And his directive is now to go and take them on. And they're, again, as always, a numerous people, much larger group than what we have there of Israelites from that. So we pick up in chapter 7, verse 9 through 15, after he's been told to go down and it's done it. And that's what it starts out with saying. It says, it happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, that being Gideon, arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. Sounds very familiar if you know what God kept telling Joshua along the way. But if you are afraid to go down, well, why should I be afraid? God just showed me the fleece 2 different times. So I must be brave about this. But God knows he isn't. He said, if you're afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say. And afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. So if you didn't get enough out of it, if you're still worried and scared, go down with your servant if you need him to go with you, and listen to what you hear down there. After that, that will encourage you that you can go up and take care of it. So then he went down, Purah his servant, to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. So that's an imposing army that's down there, both from the people amount and from their ability to move, because they've got these camels to get on from that. Verse 13, and when Gideon had come, he went down to the camp, snuck down. He's listening to him from whatever brush there is to hide in. There was a man telling a dream to his companion, and he said, I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. What a weird thing to have happen. A loaf of bread comes tumbling in. And worse than that, it came to a tent and struck it, so it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed just because this loaf of bread hit it. That's a weird dream. I mean, I've had some weird dreams, but that's a pretty weird dream. Well, what do you think out of that one? Well, then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon. They knew who was out there leading the Israelites. The son of Joash, the man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. One loaf of bread knocking down one tent, and they jumped to the conclusion, by God's direction, that Gideon and his group are going to take over the whole of the Midianite army with the Amalekites. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation that he worshipped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. So it wasn't good enough just to get the fleece situation, but now he has been able to hear what they're dealing with. What was a key part of the knowledge of things when God's people went to take over Jericho? What was a key piece of information they got from Rahab the harlot? She said, the hearts of the people are melted, right? They melt before you. They're in fear of you. And that's basically what they're getting here. These guys are saying, look, we're going to get defeated. You know, how did they jump to that conclusion? There had to be something already there. God had already introduced some worry and concern into the Midianites for that companion to jump to the conclusion that this whole thing of a loaf of barley, why barley necessarily, I don't know, but loaf of bread knocked down a tent, and suddenly that means that Gideon and his army are going to be delivered, all of Midian's going to be delivered into him. So that's the interpretation that he hears, and he goes back to the camp and goes with that. So we'll stop there. Our time is up. Any other comments? All right. We'll pick that up at that point. We'll look at some others, Solomon Stream and other things next week. Thank you.